Hey guys, this is Mr. Champlin. Today we're going to be talking about flatworms. So as you can see here, here's an example of a flatworm. I'm not sure what's going on with this guy's hand and all these scars, but certainly makes for an intriguing picture. Alright, so the phylum name for flatworms is Platyhelminthes. So platy means flat and helminth means worm in Greek. So the way I kind of remember it is platy sounds like plate, and plates are flat. So platyhelminthes, the flatworms. So as far as some of the general characteristics, they are soft-bodied. So it means, of course, like many of the invertebrates that we're going to be talking about, they don't have any kind of, skeletal, structure. And of course, they're flat, as the name suggests. Now they exhibit cephalization. So what does cephalization mean? Well, ceph means head. So whenever you see that prefix, you should think of that. So these are actually the first animals that actually have a distinct head. Now, when you see some of these pictures of these flatworms, you might say, I'm not sure which one's the head end, but trust me, they do have a head. So we saw with the Venadarians, they're actually have a different type of symmetry, so they don't have a head and a tail end, but these guys do. Where do you find these flatworms? Well, you've probably never seen one, but they're actually everywhere. They are very common in freshwater streams and lakes and ponds. If we were in school, we could go out to the ponds that are near the school, and we could actually set out traps, and we could actually attract some of these so that we could kind of check them out. There are also some that live in the ocean. If you look up, marine flatworms, there's lots of marine flatworms that are very beautiful, bright colors, and they can kind of swim, and they're pretty cool. And then not so many live on land, but there are some that live in land. Usually most of the flatworms that live on land are actually found in tropical jungles where it's really humid. Because, like snails and slugs and things like that, and earthworms, if these guys dry out, they're going to die. So they tend to live in moist habitats or live in water. Now, there are several groups of them, and some of them are free-living, and some of them are parasites. So free-living is just the opposite of a parasite. So one of the things we're going to be talking about with these worms is lots of these worms are parasites. Now we tend to focus on those parasites because those are kind of the most fascinating and the ones that have a greater effect on us as humans. However, most worms and most flatworms are actually free-living, which is to say they're not parasites and they cannot hurt you. So what can we say about the body plan of these flatworms? Well, first of all, they are triploblastic. So, I should point out, this is a picture of a marine flatworm. This is a flatworm that lives in the ocean, as you can see, very brightly colored. You can see here's the head end, and here's the tail end. So a little bit tricky on some of these worms, but here you can see there's a distinct difference. So they're triploblastic. So what does that mean? They are triploblastic, so that means that they have all three of the germ layers. So they have an endoderm, a mesoderm, and an ectoderm. So the endoderm is the inside layer, the mesoderm is the middle layer, and the ectoderm is the outer layer of cells. Now, again, this is the first group of animals that has all three layers. The last group of animals we talked about, the Venadarians, they only have two of these germ layers. They have the endoderm and the ectoderm. They have no mesoderm, though. Instead, they have the mesophyll, the mesoglia, which is sort of this middle jelly-like layer. But they only have two layers of cells, whereas these guys have three layers of cells. So, of course, going forward, all the animals we're going to talk about have these three germ layers. They also have bilateral symmetry. So again, to remind you, what does bilateral symmetry mean? It means that we can take the animal and we can essentially slice it in half, and one half is a mirror image of the other half. So we, as humans, of course, have bilateral symmetry. You can cut us in half, and one side is basically the same as the other side. Now, these flatworms are acoelomates, which is Now, when you have this A in front of something, it means not. So it means they do not have a coelom. So let's talk for a minute about what is a coelom. A coelom is a body cavity that's lined with tissue from the mesoderm. So sort of two things have to happen. You have to have this body cavity, and it's got to come from the mesoderm. So in the case of the flatworms, that there is no coelom. And if you were to take a flatworm and kind of slice it, you would see, so here is the sort of skin or the ectoderm, here's the digestive tract or the endoderm, and then you see in between, you just have this sort of solid tissue here. And of course, there's, you know, different organs that are in it, but it's basically solid, right? So humans do have a coelom, and you've seen this before if you've seen any kind of movie about surgery or something. When somebody dies and they do an autopsy, they'll actually saw through the breastbone and they'll open up the chest cavity and take out all the organs, the heart, the liver, the lungs, all that good stuff. Well, that space in there where most of your organs are, that is your coelom. So these flatworms simply don't have one. Again, it is solid sort of throughout in this middle area here. So they have no coelom. Now, some other things about earthworms, of course, is they have no skeleton. As we've already mentioned, they have no skeleton. Makes sense. They do, however, have tiny bristles called cilia, and these help them to move. So almost like we mentioned these when we talked about, you know, bacteria and some of the, like the paramecium and some of those guys. But in this case, these are multicellular animals that have cilia on the belly surface, and it helps them to glide through the water. They of course also have 2 layers of muscles, which help them to also move. So they can kind of swim, although not really that well. So in just a moment, I'll show you a quick video of the flatworm and sort of how it moves. I do want to mention about circulation. Of course, humans have a heart, and it moves the blood in blood vessels, you know, throughout our bodies. However, in flatworms, they're much, much simpler. So the only way, they have no blood or blood vessels. So the only way things can move around their body is through diffusion. So diffusion is just kind of this natural process where things move from more concentrated to less concentrated. So it's a very slow process, but it works for the flatworms because they're really tiny and they're really flat. So things don't have to sort of move that far. It wouldn't work with humans because we're much too big, and it would just take forever for oxygen and food to diffuse throughout our bodies, because diffusion is a very slow process. And that's, of course, why we have, you know, blood and blood vessels and a heart to pump it. But these guys simply don't need that. They're small enough and simple enough that they can rely on diffusion to kind of move things around their bodies. So let's take a look at a quick video that shows us the worm moving and sort of what that looks like. All right, this is a bust. The video is not really working that well. Okay, I will attach this video so you can see it, because I don't think it's going to work too well. Yeah, all right, this was a complete bust. Okay. Digestion. So let's talk really quickly about digestion. So in the of course, like all animals, they need to eat, and so like we saw with the jellyfish and the sea anemones and those guys, we saw they had an incomplete digestive tract, which means what? It means that there's no anus present. So what does that mean? Well, it means wherever the food goes in, that's where the undigested food has to go out. So they do have a digestive cavity that acts like a stomach and an intestine, and you can see here it's evenly distributed throughout the body. And that's the reason for that is A, it gives more surface area for digestion, and B, it helps the nutrients to reach the different parts of the body, because remember, they have no circulatory system. So things have to diffuse, food has to diffuse to cells that need it. So the closer the branches of the digestive tract are to the cells, the easier it is and the quicker it is for them to diffuse. Now, you'll notice here in the middle of the body here, and then over more towards the head end here, there's these flatworms actually have a trunk-like organ called a proboscis, and they use this to suck in their food. Now, again, the food will go into their digestive cavity, it will get digested. Anything that's not digested will be re-expelled out through the pharynx, which is this trunk-like organ here. Sorry about that. They have sexual and asexual reproduction, which we will see with many of these simple animals. So they can actually reproduce asexually, or in other words, make a clone of themselves by undergoing this process called fission, where they kind of split into two. So here you see an earthworm, I keep calling them earthworms, a flatworm kind of pulling itself apart and kind of turning into two worms. And you can see this process happening. By the way, this same process can happen with some of the cnidarians. I've actually had sea anemones that have done this before. So it's quite fascinating to watch. They literally pull themselves into two, and then each half sort of forms a different organism. Of course, they're clones. They're genetically identical, but they're two different organisms. Also, with the flatworms, most of the flatworms are hermaphrodites, and I'm sure you've heard this term before, and that just simply means that they contain sex organs of both the males and the females. So typically what happens is two flatworms will kind of come together, and each flatworm will fertilize the eggs of the other worm. So they kind of have, again, they have male and female organs in the same worm. Yes. So I'll include a few videos. There's a few interesting videos that you probably want to see as far as the reproduction goes. So here's a video that's going to be talking about fission and how they can sort of reproduce. These are very common experiments done with these flatworms. Okay, so again, with this with this sort of ability of fission, the worms can split into two. Also, too, if humans were to take them and to cut them into pieces, they can regenerate. And many times each of those pieces can become a completely different worm. All right, so just a couple more things. Let's start with the nervous system of these guys. So the nervous system is pretty simple. Notice they have nerves that sort of run down the sides here, and they have nerves that run in between. So this is called a ladder-like nervous system. And you'll notice in the head end, they have two eyes. They actually have these kind of cute, cross-eyed, look to them. And they also have these sort of these things that are called ganglia. And here they're calling it a brain, but it's not technically a brain. It's just a cluster of nerve cells. So it's kind of a proto-brain or a pre-brain. It's not quite a brain. And again, they have eye spots. So these eyes actually can't see as good as our eyes, but they can see mostly light and dark and, maybe shadows. So, but they do have these very simple eyes. And again, it's very simple, but it works for them. They don't need a very large, complex brain to survive like we do. And lastly, excretion. So how do they get rid of their waste? So now when we're talking about waste products, I'm not talking about like what you might call poop. When we're talking about waste products, we're talking about nitrogenous waste. So nitrogenous waste is the waste that's produced when we break down proteins and when we break down DNA and RNA and stuff like that. So these nitrogenous waste would be produced. Now, normally your kidneys would filter the nitrogenous waste out of your blood. It would be stored in your bladder, and then you would pee it out. Again, these guys are very, very simple. They don't have an excretory system that can filter out their blood and excrete from the body that's quite as complicated as ours. What do they have? Well, they have these things that are called flame cells. So they don't even have tissues or organs responsible for excretion, just these cells. So again, very simple. So these flame cells, their job is to, again, filter out or extract this nitrogenous waste from the tissues and then excrete it from the body. So how do they excrete it? Well, essentially, there are pores throughout the skin of the flatworm. And essentially, the nitrogenous waste, or the pee, for lack of a better word, would simply ooze out of the skin. Now, this may seem very odd, but actually it's not that strange, because as humans, we also do something very similar. Obviously, you pee to get rid of a lot of your nitrogenous waste, but also when we sweat, some of that nitrogenous waste is actually excreted from our bodies. So kind of similarly. So this is one of the reasons why sweat can smell bad, is because these nitrogenous wastes get sort of excreted through the pores of the skin, and then bacteria can then grow in them, and it can make things smell bad. So we all know what old smelly gym socks smell like. That is what we're talking about. All right, so I believe